Released during the 6th generation of consoles, the Nintendo GameCube would become Nintendo's first officially released disc-based system that would go on to release a stellar lineup of games, ranging from Super Smash Bros. Melee and Luigi's Mansion, Mario Kart Double Dash to a handful of Zelda titles like Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. With it struggling to secure third-party support, Capcom looked to capitalize on this by preparing to release 5 exclusive titles that they hoped that would benefit from a drought of releases. Killer 7, Beautiful Joe, Piano 3, Resident Evil 4, and one that is bathed in mystery about its development and initial cancellation. For this edition of The Uncommon Valley, we look at the timeline of the Capcom 5, loss of goodwill with Nintendo, and the cancellation of Dead Phoenix. During 2002, the Nintendo GameCube had a difficult time competing with the PlayStation 2 and Xbox for market share. The main reason for its lack of success was the lack of DVD playback compatibility and third-party support. This put it at a disadvantage compared to both Sony and Microsoft's consoles. Although the GameCube had some great games, this alone was not enough to drive sales up against the current market leader at the time, the PlayStation 2. Third-party game developers were especially wary of the Nintendo 64 due to the predecessor's lack of support from major companies. This resulted in many big names deciding to jump ship and focus on PlayStation instead. Many gamers were not enthusiastic about the Nintendo console, as compared to times when the NES and Super Nintendo were as popular as ever. Then in 2002, Capcom made a strategic move to revitalize the support Nintendo needed desperately with the launch of what they would then call the Capcom 5 series. 5 video games that were initially said to be exclusive to the GameCube. However, Capcom later clarified that this information was not accurate. Ultimately, almost every single one of the titles Capcom produced would be ported over later on the PS2. But out of the 5 projects, Dead Phoenix was under continuous development until it eventually got cancelled. Capcom held a surprise conference in November of 2002, introducing the 5 new titles, one of which was the Dead Phoenix project. The game was initially slated to launch in Japan first during the spring of 2003. Capcom would give a brief overview of their upcoming game, revealing that the main character will be Phoenix, a member of the Flyer clan who's given the ability of flight. It was then said that Phoenix was going to be a third-person shooter, similar in vein to the Panzer Dragoon series, where you were able to control Phoenix while they were flying and engaging in combat against various enemies. The narrative was based in a dynamic, ever-changing metropolis full of monsters, and the protagonist's choices and deeds had an impact on how the city behaved and developed. Then, during the start of 2003, an announcement was made regarding the exclusivity of the 4 GameCube titles, Dead Phoenix, Beautiful Joe, Piano 3, and Killer 7, which were not bound to any contract. The only game with a true exclusivity deal for the console was none other than Resident Evil 4. Capcom usually waits until the game is first released on a specific platform before making a port, and by using this approach, developers can decide if it was practical to create a version of their game for another platform. The success of Dead Phoenix would have heavily depended on its reviews and critical reception. It would seem as though that every single game announced would actually make its planned release. However, through some unexpected reason, Dead Phoenix's development would begin to go cold. Dead Phoenix was meant to be released in the original expected window, but that did not happen, and Capcom unfortunately did not mention it at their 2003 E3 presentation, where other games from the Capcom 5 were actually introduced. Capcom refused to provide any updates on the status of the game, simply responding with a "nothing new to show" comment. This was to hint that the game was still in development, however no further information or content was to be released after this simple update. Later in the year, around August, Capcom revealed that they had taken down one of their games from their website and officially cancelled it, which led many to question as to why this decision was made. The managers did not provide any justification for why the project was terminated. This might have been because Capcom was shifting their focus to multi-platform releases, and would only stick to titles that they would assume would actually make them money. Because around this time, Capcom was announcing that they had reported losses of over $103 million during the 2002 fiscal year. This was due to poor sales and prolonged development times. In the end, the company announced that an updated number would eventually be over $163 million in losses overall. And while Resident Evil 4 was one of the announced titles that had a very prolonged development of over 5 years, starting all the way back in 1999 and eventually culminating into its 2005 release, there were 4 previous versions of Resident Evil 4 that were discarded along the way, making the final product deemed to be worth all the effort put into it. Another tactic for the reason why they would have to cancel certain titles like Dead Phoenix was because they were trying to focus more on titles that they would deem to be profitable, rather than new IPs. This would deem to be true for the company's motivation going forward. Only Resident Evil 4 earned an overwhelming success at launch was due to it being based on an existing property and a highly sought-after sequel of the previous 3 games. Beautiful Joe 2 was quickly developed soon after the first game and was ready to launch a year later. Due to the tight timelines, some features that were planned to be excluded, such as cooperative play, reach a larger audience and increase its profits. Beautiful Joe 2 was released simultaneously on both the GameCube and the PlayStation 2. In order to successfully develop the sequel of their game Beautiful Joe, Capcom established Clover Studio, an independent production team responsible for creating new IPs. The studio was formed from the core members of Team Beautiful. In its short life, the studio only produced 2 intellectual properties, and Capcom would eventually close the studio in late 2006, following the initial exits of Atsushi Inaba, Hideki Kamiya, and Shinji Mikami. This was part of a larger trend where influential employees, such as Yoshiki Okamoto in 2003 and Kenji Ifune in 2010. The developers of Clover Games left Capcom as they felt as the company's higher-ups had been hesitant and opposed to new innovative ideas, and they actually created Platinum Games with other ex-Clover members. And in 2008, they would establish the Platinum 3, and the titles would consist of Mad World, Infinite Space, and Bayonetta, to honor the ambitious and creative spirit of the original Capcom 5 initiative. The release of Killer 7 marked a new milestone for game designer Suda51, as this was the stepping stone for Suda51's successful career beyond Japan, being the first title released by his studio, Grasshopper Manufacture. Despite its lack of success in terms of sales, the cult status of the game motivated the director to give 2 of his previously Japan exclusive titles, The Silver Case and Flower, Sun, and Rain, to be given a remake for Western audiences. Suda51's career took off with the release of No More Heroes, a game that was both well received by critics and gamers alike, resulting in massive successes on the Wii and even the re-releases over on the Switch, 360, and PS3. This title was followed up by a collaboration with Shinji Mikami on the horror title Shadows of the Damned. Despite the overall failure of the project, after testing out the action game mechanics in Piano 3, Mikami refined it more and improved upon its predecessor, which would be known as Vanquish. This showed a significant evolution in the gameplay compared to Piano 3. Critics have praised Piano 3's battle system, saying its stylish, dance-like movement and intense game mechanics, and design create an experience comparable to the iconic Bayonetta series. Conversely, Adam Sorice from Nintendo Dojo argued that Capcom's decision not to feature female protagonists in their games for many years, probably a result of the unsuccessful commercial run of the women-centric game. Each individual game released as part of the Capcom 5 had a significant impact on video game design that still resonates to this very day. Over on the Resident Evil side, it became a huge success and is now often noted as one of the most influential games of the decade. Its over-the-shoulder perspective has been widely copied and implemented in many other popular third-person shooters and action titles, such as the Gears of War and Arkham series. The Dead Space series and Grand Theft Auto have taken inspiration from Leon's precision-aiming laser sight, which offers an alternative to the conventional lock-on targeting. Resident Evil 4 further developed the successful survival horror conventions that introduced in the original Resident Evil. Resident Evil 4 has long been credited for setting the trend of horror games getting more focused on combat. This example was followed by many releases such as Silent Hill Homecoming and the reboot of Alone in the Dark. According to reports, Capcom's decision to break away from their exclusivity commitment with Nintendo for the GameCube, especially during Resident Evil 4, was not taken lightly and led to strained relationship between the two companies that lasted for several years. Despite the fact that Capcom did not provide further support for the GameCube, it still sold 22 million units. This was much less than the 32 million units sold for the Nintendo 64, and a fraction of the 155 million units that the PlayStation 2 had set. Resident Evil 4 was initially released for the Wii in 2007, and followed by high-definition re-release for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in 2011. While the Nintendo 64 and the GameCube lacked any sort of third-party support, this all changed with the release of the Nintendo Wii in 2006. Until 2009, when the Wii had been able to manage with its own in-house titles, and sales figures for the console remained ever so high. However, as demand for new content rose, the company could no longer keep up with it. This ultimately led to a dip in their profits and inspired them to reach out directly to third-party developers for help. Unfortunately, this did not come to fruition due to weak performance of the Wii U. However, with the successful launch of the Switch in 2017, Nintendo established itself again with more third-party support. We've looked hard into the Capcom 5 and seen that a majority of them have had either a successful or not so successful launch. But through all that we have looked at, was the cancellation of Dead Phoenix a significant blow? If one compares the quality of other Capcom 5 titles, it is evident that with enough time it could have become one of the best exclusives for the console, or an underrated gem for the PlayStation 2. Although only 4 of the games were released, Piano 3 was the one that didn't meet expectations. The initial game version had garnered a lot of attention. However, it is possible that a chaotic camera that struggles to keep up with the 3D flight would have been a major issue upon release. While not much is known about the game, it is clear that something went wrong during its development, and unfortunately, this was a title that wasn't able to get off the ground and make its successful comeback despite all the speculation going forward. Check out the other videos on our channel today for more obscure video gaming history, and thank you for watching The Uncommon Valley as we look to the past into the present.